Hello, welcome to the Brand Builders podcast. My name is Paul Archer, and I'm really excited to be joined by Barry Wolins. How are you doing?
Great. Thanks very much for inviting me to do this. It's not often us old guys get to talk about some of the old crap that we did.
Well, this is the opportunity. This is it. So, I mean, you've had a storied career working with some incredible brands, some of my favorite brands from when I was growing up. And so, I'm excited to learn, how did it all start, and how did you kind of come to be working in the world of brand building?
Well, firstly, let me just ask you, what year were you born in?
I was born in 1987.
Okay, so that's long after I started in the apparel business and the surfwear business. So a lot of the stuff might be a little archaic and a little bit new to you, but pretty much, and I can go deep into this, but I started surfing when I was young, when I was about 12 years old in Durban, South Africa, and it just hooked me. It really did. And we didn't live that close to the beach, but it was quite a mission to get to the beach. But all I wanted to do was surf, and I was doing really well in my sort of beginning of high school, academically. And then I started surfing, and it all and it all fell apart. I just used to go surfing. I hardly ever went to school. I managed to get through high school by the skin of my teeth. And long story, I ended up. I've always been quite artistic. I could always draw. So when I started, you got to go back into. There was no graphic design, computer, anything. The technology highlight was. Well, it's going to make me sound really old, but I remember the one job I had. This was like this new thing. They gave me an adding machine. I don't know if you even know what an adding machine is.
Is it a calculator?
Well, it was big, okay, and it had a whole lot of numbers on it, and it had a handle and a roll of paper. And what you'd do is you'd if you wanted to add, you'd enter the number, then you'd pull the handle, then you'd add, and you'd pull the handle, and at the end it gave you a total. And if you'd screwed up one of those numbers, it was a whole big nightmare. So that was technology in those days. And then they had a telex machine. I don't know if you even know what a telex machine is. The telex machine was long before the fax machine. So you had this telex operator that would punch into, it was almost like braille. It was like a ticker tape, and punch the message, and then it would go into a machine, and this machine would somehow relay it to whoever you were sending it to. It was archaic. So when I started, and I was really pretty good at art and stuff like that, and I used to draw things, and I was quite into fashion and and I got a job as a trainee buyer for a big clothing apparel retail company, Edgars. And one of the things, when they found out I could draw, I would have to design stuff and try and give the manufacturers an idea of what they wanted to buy. So I started designing at that point. But then they moved me to Johannesburg, which is an inland city, kind of like Chicago, right off the beach. And I couldn't cope with it. And my boss actually got me a job at this factory back in Durban as a pattern maker and a designer. And then I moved back to Durban, and then I signed up to the Technicon to do design. I walked in on the first day, and I was the only straight guy there, right? And I had no concept. So having finished high school, I never did any other this was my first entry into some sort of further education. I walk in, and I'm the straight guy. And the non-straight guys were very flamboyant. And the first lesson, they were draping chiffon onto this like a chiffon dress onto this figure. Pretty much I went there for one day and I said, this is not for me. And I ended up working in this factory as a pattern maker and a designer. And, from there, some friends of mine had the only real cool surf shop in Durban. It was called Le Mans Surfboards. And actually one of the guys there, Paul Nodi, he's gone on he was the head of Billabong in America. He took them public, or he was part of the team that took them public. And now he's got, in my opinion, the coolest surf brand in the market right now. It's called Whistler. But anyway, so Paul Nodi and Mike Lamont, they had the surf shop, and they had just received the Lightning Bolt license, but they had no clue about apparel or about design or anything. And I was the only person they knew that surfed that had any kind of background in apparel. So they asked me to come and join them. So I ended up going there, and pretty much as I started, all those like Soweto riots, that was in the apartheid era in South Africa, and Lightning Bolt pulled out. They said that everyone was sanctioning any kind of stuff against South Africa, so Lightning Bolt pulled out. So I ended up working in the surf shop, working retail, and then designing a few things for the store. But we were limited in our production abilities, and so I worked at Le Mans Surfboards. And through that, I got to meet pretty much all the international surfers, because while I was doing the clothing thing, I couldn't afford it. They were paying me not a whole lot, so I got a job as a bouncer, and it ended up I was being the DJ at this like the coolest club in Durban at the time. That's where all the kids wanted to go. So I got to meet between the surf shop and between the club that I was working at. I used to work at the club maybe 4 nights a week, and I also used to do mobile discos to try and earn money. And I got to meet pretty much everyone. Everyone knew who I was. And then all this in Durban, part of the pro surf, and you got to understand, pro surfing at that point was in its infancy. It was like pioneering. What it is today and what it was then was completely different. So there were 4 big major surf contests in Durban over July, and all the Australian surfers and Hawaiian surfers, American surfers used to arrive. And because I could talk on a microphone without being intimidated, they asked me if I wanted to be the commentator at these events. So I ended up being the commentator. And you have to understand, in those days, people used to plan their vacations around these events and come to Durban to watch the surfing, because it was a huge thing, because surfing was really cool. It was a whole different era as it is today. It was new. The evolution of surfboard design was just in its infancy, and people were trying all these different things. The music was cool. It was a whole different vibe to before, where it was a whole different generation coming out of the sort of hippie era into professional surfing, and surfing was up there with any other kind of aspirational thing. And in amongst that demographic of beachgoers, it was the biggest thing ever. So I ended up being the commentator, and I met pretty much all the legends: Mark Richards, Rabbit Bartholomew, Sean Thompson was the guy I grew up with. He was South Africa's only world champion, and pretty much anyone. So
what year was this?
This must have been around 78, 79, around about there, into the 80s.
Right. So it's like just coming in the beginning of the 80s, you're working in apparel, you're DJing, you're a bouncer as well, and you're the MC at the surf competition.
Yeah. So those surf competitions were a huge part of how I ended up where I did end up. So anyway, one day I had a bit of an argument with my boss, Mike Lamont. He was at best he was a dick. I mean, he just didn't know how to deal with people. And anyway, we had this argument, and I left. I didn't really have anything to do, so I started making T-shirts, and just with surf designs on and stuff like that. And I ended up opening a little factory. I think I had 3 sewing machines, which I bought. I traded in my motorbike, and I bought 3 sewing machines, and I rented a little space. And I had this lady, she was sitting on I didn't even have a chair. I remember she had a tin can, and she would sew these things up. And it started that way. And that grew. I started making pretty much product for Gotcha, Instinct. Those were the 2 big South African brands. And just general, just CMTs, where CMT is cut, make, and trim. People supply you the fabric and their patterns and everything, and you just cut it, sew it together, and give it back, and it's all cash. So that kind of grew, and I thought, then I started my own brand, because I had a brand and it was called Barry Robert Designs. And then my accountant one day, and I say accountant very loosely, he was just a friend of mine who knew how to keep books. He just said, if ever this thing grows, you're not going to be able, it won't be worth much because it's your name. It was Barry, my middle name's Robert, so it's Barry Robert. Wolins is just too hard to spell and pronounce. And so he just said, you won't be able to sell it for much. He says, you need to find another name for what you're doing. And at the time, Lacoste was cool. It was like the big brand. I remember seeing people had alligators tattooed on their chest. And so I was trying to find some sort of logo, symbol, and more some type of animal, because but in Africa, a crocodile or an alligator is not a cool thing. It's kind of got all sort of tribal tradition, and it's not a cool thing. And so I was trying to find an animal that would cross over genders, would cross over age groups. And that's one of the things in brand building. You've got to look at who your target market is. And it's one thing, and no disrespect, because I have the utmost respect, like Liquid Death is like the cool canned water. I don't know if you have Liquid Death in England. Oh, you don't have Liquid Death?
I don't think we do. Like, what is Liquid Death?
It's a phenomenon. It's a canned water, and you need to Google it, and you need to look at I've got pictures of it if you want me to send you, but it's a can. It's a black can with a skull on it, and it's got in big Gothic letters Liquid Death, but it's actually water. They have water and mineral water, sparkling water. They have plain still water and sparkling water, and they've marketed this thing, this Liquid Death, and this is getting back to finding a niche. What they did is they figured out there's a whole lot of people in bars that don't drink, or and you don't want to be sipping a glass of water, so they got this hectic-looking can. So, and they supplied bars, tattoo parlors, barbershops. They didn't go into the mainstream supermarket. They figured out who their target market was, and they started in, I think, 2019, and right before COVID. I looked them up the other day. They're now valued at 525 million.
Wow!
Now they're in Whole Foods, but it's so for anyone starting a brand, there's a gap whatever you want to do. You just have to figure out how to get there and who your target market is. I mean, what's even more I don't know, I would say, no, I don't say funny, I would say incredible, and it's something that you guys should look at, is they get hate mail from all these Christian people because it says liquid death. The mineral water, that is, it's small. You don't even see it. If you didn't know it was mineral water, you would think it was hell in a can. So most of their advertising and their marketing comes from these Christian and environmental people. These environmental people going, well, cans aren't cool. It takes more energy than to make an aluminum can than it does. They get their whole marketing thing is based on their hate mail.
Amazing.
Yeah, it's incredible. So anyway, I was looking for an animal, and this is going back way back. And then I found a bear, and I thought, well, a bear is cool, but it can't be a cuddly little teddy bear. It's got to be kind of just and I could draw. And so I drew this bear head. And in those days, there was no click on, and you got a font book, and you can choose your fonts, and you can do that. The only way you could get and hand drawing it is really difficult to get it exact. So I don't know if you know what letraset is.
No.
Anyway, letraset, if you wanted any kind of fonts, you would go to like a stationery store, and letraset was a list, as a page of fonts. So you'd choose that font, and there was a page, and you would rub it, and you could spell out your own word. You'd rub the A, and then you'd find the next letter, and you could create a word using that font. But it was a mission. So anyway, I found this letraset thing, and I put bear underneath it. Right at the bottom of the letraset thing, it said Letraset International Limited. So, and that's cool. So I just took the International Limited, and it fitted exactly under this head that I had drawn. And so it was Bear International Limited. It was just
instant worldwide appeal.
Yeah, and in those days, South Africa was under the embargo list and the sanction list and stuff like that. So all the big brands had sanctions against South Africa, and I'm talking about Nike. Any brand that you could think of didn't want to have anything to do with South Africa. So suddenly I was an international brand, just by the virtue of letraset, had that word underneath the thing. And then to make it even better, I moved out of my factory. My first little factory was in a little lane called Badger Lane, and then I moved into another factory. And this premises was in a road called Canada Road. So I put on my neck label, I put made in Canada, and I put the road RD in a circle that looked like a registered sign. So suddenly my brand was Bear International Limited, made in Canada. And everybody thought it was imported. So suddenly, just by virtue of the fact that it was imported, it came a little bit cooler. But that was just how that labeling thing. So getting back to the surfing events. So being the commentator at those events, what I would do, and the main contest was the Gunston 500. That was like a huge contest in those days. And I was a commentator, and I was friends with all the guys. So I would make all the Gunston crew bear sweatshirts and tracksuits. I'd give them all out. And then I would give out, and to some of the surfers, I'd make them a cool. I used to give out a lot of stuff to the pro surfers. So suddenly you'd see Michael Thompson or, Mark Richards. He thought the stuff was so cool. He ended up asking me to make Mark Richards stuff in South Africa. And then during the event, we'd have like what we called a bun fight. So I would there's 50,000 people on the beach, and I would say, okay, we're going to throw out some bear T-shirts. And it became it was actually, you wouldn't be able to do it today. It was, it was crazy. People were fighting over this stuff. So during those Gunston events, during those surfing events, that was my big marketing push, because I didn't really have the budget and to do anything else. So it became really cool. That's how, through that surfing event and through sponsoring all those core crew that worked at the events and some of the surfers, that's kind of we became a surf brand. And which was so amazing because we didn't make a pair of board shorts. We just, my factory just made like T-shirts, hoodies, sweatshirts. It was all just knitted fabrics. But suddenly we were this international surf brand that didn't make any surf product. But because of the people that were wearing it and that whole aspirational surfing demographic, we became a surf brand. And it grew it grew so much that I actually I joined one of my customers who was a huge company. I couldn't finance it anymore. I didn't have the money because the biggest problem when starting a brand or starting a company, as I'm sure you know, is financing the growth. It's you can be cool and you can Michael Thompson. I don't know if you know who Michael Thompson is.
Pro surfer.
Yeah, he was a great surfer and he started Gotcha. And he's Sean Thompson's cousin. And Gotcha had to be the most forward fashion brand, never mind surf, in the 80s. It was Gotcha just broke every rule. And Michael Thompson's quote, which I always remember, he had a couple of quotes that I always remember, but the main quote was, "Size is the enemy of cool," And it's true. You're cool when you're small. To stay cool when you're big, suddenly you've got to finance things and you've got to do things, and you've got to appeal to a broader market and a bigger demographic, and suddenly you start losing your cool because you're growing.
Let's double click on that for a second. So, I mean, brand building and being cool, are they the same? Is this a surf industry thing, or do you think that's the same for every single brand in the world? It's like you have to be cool, and having a brand is having to be cool.
Yeah, I think if you're in the aspirational market, like surfing, it's such a limited market. It's not like a big sports brand like Nike or Adidas. They've got soccer, they've got these big sports, which, if you've got Messi or Ronaldo or Michael Jordan, you're cool anyway. And you have, like the number of followers, people who follow football or golf or basketball is way bigger. So when you're a small brand and you're in a demographic that is very aspirant, like surfing, suddenly if your dad's wearing this wearing Quiksilver, it's not cool. It takes that sort of individual part of it away. So that Michael Thompson quote, "Size is the enemy of cool," in those small niche markets, it is real.
And so you said earlier that the surf brand Vizsla is the coolest surf brand going right now. They're pretty big. I mean, what is it that makes something like Vizsla cool?
Well, I think it's because the surf brands that I was involved with, like Quiksilver, and then the other big brands, Billabong and Ripcurl and Vulcan, became, suddenly at Quiksilver, we were the board short company and we were the cool surf company, and then suddenly we started. I mean, they made some at the corporate office, because it was a publicly traded company and you have shareholders, and they made some decisions that were. And that's where the enemy of cool is the size. Suddenly you start making jeans and you're competing with Diesel, and those days Diesel and all those other cool denim brands, but you're a surf company. Why? Like Ripcurl, when I took over Ripcurl in America, it was insolvent. And Ripcurl was a wetsuit company. And our biggest. And the other thing they made was accessories like backpacks and wetsuit bags and stuff like that. But the biggest problem that Ripcurl had when I was doing it was getting into stores with apparel, because they looked at us as a wetsuit brand, not as an apparel brand. And they looked at, for the apparel, they would look at Quiksilver and Gotcha, and, So Whistler, when Paul Noddy, because he was the head of Billabong, so he understands this whole thing. But why Whistler, I think, is cool is because it's surf. It's not skate. It's not street. They don't even try to appeal to anything except surfers. And their whole marketing thing is, their tagline is creators and innovators. And it's all about surfboards. Paul Noddy himself is he's obsessed with surfboards. He makes surfboards in his garage. When I started working with him, they were making surfboards. So surfboards is the driving part of what they do. And they're not interested in mass-produced surf. They make some cool boards, asymmetrical tails and flex tails. And, it's not about conventional stereotype mass production surfboards. And they're not as big as you might think. They are big, but they remain so true to what they started out being. That's what I think is makes them very cool.
And do you think that has crossover appeal because it's so specific that people who might not even surf would wear Vizsla gear, or do you think that sits firmly with people? If you're in the know, and that's all that matters?
I think it's a bit of both, actually. I think if you're in the know, you definitely know. And I think it's getting, then that comes down to your distribution. And that's one of the problems with creating a brand. When you start, and getting back to growing the brand, when you're starting off, especially in the apparel industry, when you're starting off and you're just making a few T-shirts and you're making a few other things, it's easy to do. Suddenly, you start getting orders from everyone suddenly, when you become cool, everybody wants you. So now you have the problem where you have minimums on production. You have to, if you're going to China or anywhere else, no one's just going to make you 100, that shirt you're wearing. No one's going to make 100 of those. Just to weave that fabric and that pattern, they're going to say, you need to order 1,000 minimum, 500 of a color. So you can order that flannel that you're wearing. You can either order 1,000 of that color, or you can order 500 of that color and 500 of another color. If you want to order a third color, it's another 500. So if you've got 3 colors, and if you're a brand, you're suddenly competing with the big brands. You can't just walk in and say, we've got 1 shirt. You have to have 10 shirts, and each shirt has to come in at least 2 colors. So suddenly your numbers just become huge. And then you go to a store, you go on your sales, the sales guys will go to the store, and the guy buys 6 of those and 8 of those, and suddenly you've got 1,500 of these in your warehouse, or they're coming. What do you do? So the only way you can grow your brand nowadays is to open your own retail store. Because then you can showcase all your products. If you're just in one, like a big surf shop, the big surf shop might take 3 board shorts, 2 flannels, a hoodie, and something else. Meantime, you're making 10 pairs of board shorts and you're making 8 flannels. So the only way you can really showcase your brand, and that's where the hardest part about growing a brand becomes the minimums. And then with that is the financing. So Whistler have done an amazing job at controlling their distribution. They're not in in Huntington Beach, there's 2 huge surf shops, Jack's Surfboards and Huntington Surf and Sport. They're across the road from each other, and each one is like a Walmart. And you won't find Whistler in any of those stores. But just around the corner, Whistler have their own store with all their wetsuits and all their product all nicely displayed, so you can see what Whistler are doing. So that's the difference between Whistler and in my opinion, obviously, and the other brands.
It's a proper D2C sort of channel. So, like, just so it's what are the early 80s, and you've got Bear International, and it's going pretty well. People want it. It's just become this incredibly cool brand in South Africa because actually nobody can get an international brand, and they didn't realize that it's actually made locally. And what happens next? I mean, how do you start scaling it?
So I mean, I joined this other company who were willing to finance it, and I sort of gave them all shares in it, and we were part of this big company. And I used to go to America to the trade shows to see what was new and see what was cool, just to keep my sort of finger on the pulse. And a friend of mine was working for this company who were the licensees for Gotcha, and I thought, let me go and see these people, see if they want to license Bear, because I was in love with California. Since I started surfing, I used to see these Californian surfers come, and I used to read the magazines. I used to have, in South Africa, those surfer magazines and surfing magazines were like the Bible. And then so I was in love with California. All I wanted to do was move to California. So I went to see this company about licensing Bear, my brand. I thought that would be cool if they licensed it. Then it'd give me a gap to get to California, and I could, Anyway, I went to see them, and they were quite impressed with what I was showing them, and we sort of spoke about it, and they said they'd get back to me. It's one of those, we'll get back to you, thanks for coming kind of thing. And then next thing, I was about a couple of weeks later, they contacted me and they said, look, thanks very much. We're not interested in Bear, but we've just acquired the license for Rusty apparel. Now, Rusty was one of the best surfboard brands in California. I mean, all the top pros were riding Rusty boards in those days. So they were the Gotcha licensees for certain categories, but they just acquired the whole Rusty apparel line as a licensee. And they said, we don't want your brand, but we want you. We want you to come and head the Rusty apparel. And that was like, oh, crap, what do I do now? So anyway, long story, I ended up selling my shares in Bear, and I moved to California to start Rusty apparel, which was a shock to me, because I thought I knew everything. But you got to understand, in South Africa, and the apparel industry is completely different to the American apparel industry. I was used to doing everything. I did pretty much. I designed the product. I oversaw the production. I was involved in sales. I was involved in pretty much every part of the thing. And suddenly I get to America, and you'd put a range of clothing together. In South Africa, you put a range of clothing, you'd go and see the customers, and you get some sales, then you'd come back, collate your orders, and then go and buy the fabric, get into production. In America, it's a whole lot different. You have to have the product before you even sell it. You have to go into production. And in in America, everyone's a specialist. I'm a board short designer. I can't do that. This is what I do. And then I'm a stuff, and they have all these different titles for different people, where I designed board shorts, I designed shirts, I did pretty much the whole thing. There you got a specialist, you got a designer. In Quiksilver especially, they were over the top with all these specialists they had. So anyway, I went to America and started Rusty, and I remember the guy said to me, we're sitting in a sales meeting, and the guy goes, well, this is going to be a 1:15 start, 3:15 cancel. And I'm just nodding. I had no idea what he was saying, because I'd never heard. It was like Greek, I swear. It was so, and I didn't want to act like a complete arsehole and not pretend I didn't know what they were talking about. So 115 start, 315 cancel. In America, the month comes first. South Africa, you're writing 15th of January, you write 15/1/22. Here you write it 1/15/22. So 115 start was the 15th of January start, March the 15th cancel. But just little things like that. I had no idea what people were saying. So it was a learning curve. I was like trying to fake it when I got there. I was faking it properly. I think the accent helped quite a bit.
and so what was Rusty at the time? Like, how big was it? What sort of stage was it? And you were going to launch the apparel side of things. Is that right?
Yeah, Rusty was one of the bigger and better surfboard companies. And I think that the only kind of apparel they'd made were a few T-shirts. So they were nothing in the apparel industry. And that goes back to what I was saying about Ripcurl being a wetsuit company. The hardest thing about that is suddenly you're a surfboard company, and now you're just jumping in on the apparel bandwagon. Suddenly all these companies have got clothing, because Quiksilver and those guys were doing such a good job. And so when we started, it pretty much was nothing. There was no sales. So, I think we got, I'm not 100% sure. I think we might have got to I would say 15 million in the time that I was there, which wasn't a lot when you look at, it was a lot for that brand, because you have, at that beginning stage, you're competing with all those other companies. So the easiest thing to sell is a T-shirt. But when you're selling a pair of woven shorts, or you're selling a technical jacket or something like that, now you're competing with proper apparel companies. So selling T-shirts was easy because everyone wants the logo. The guy can afford a T-shirt. He might not be able to afford the $40 pair of shorts, but if the T-shirt's covering up, nobody knows what shorts he's wearing anyway. So it doesn't really matter. So selling T-shirts is a great branding exercise, and it's great for any kind of branding, but it's not really good if you're trying to be a legitimate apparel company. So it was tough, and it was tough. We had to get a sales force together, and you go to trade shows, and I remember, Rusty he's a person. It's not, his name's Rusty Preissendorfer. It's not like it was just a brand. And he's a very creative person, and he's very artistic. And he drew his logo, and he held the corner of every page for anything that had anything to do with art. But I remember quite a funny story. So we're in this trade show, and in America, the trade shows are huge. In those days, action sports retailers was a huge event. People come from, I used to, when I was in South Africa, I used to go to those shows to see what was happening. So Rusty had just seen this Superman movie, and I don't know which one it was, but it was one when he's in the cave with all those icicles, and it was like, I don't know, so he had this idea that he wanted his logo to look like these icicle things that was in this cave. So he had designed and had this logo made, but the logo was as big as a VW car, right? It wasn't just a little logo. It was made out of perspex. It was really amazingly cool. So we went to the trade show, but in America they got all these unions. You're not allowed to pick up a hammer. They got these union guys who do nothing, and it's such a ripoff because you're not allowed to do anything. You have to call a union guy to do it. So we were just going to hang this thing from the roof. Long story short, it ended up costing more to hang this logo above the booth than it did for the whole booth, because we had to get union guys. Then they had to get a forklift truck, and there was a different union guy, and it was insane. So I don't even know why I started with that, but
so let's sort of hover back in. So you've just sold your shares, you've joined Rusty, you're launching your apparel brand.
Yeah.
And it's kind of taken it to a decent sort of size, about 15 million or so turnover. Like, what was the next phase? What comes after that?
So while I was at Rusty, Ripcurl, it's an Australian company, and the two founders, Brian Singer and Doug Warbrick, his nickname was Claw, they started there. They had these different licensees in America, and I think they'd gone through, I don't know, 8 different presidents, and they ended up, they were insolvent, right? And the guys from Ripcurl, the guy contacted me and said, look, do I want to be the president of Ripcurl? No, not really, because I kind of knew, everyone knew what the situation they were in. And
Always in Chalice.
Yeah. And then I was in Hong Kong on a buying trip and I got a call from Brian Singer. Suddenly, Brian Singer phones me, and I didn't really know him personally, but I knew who he was. I was in Hong Kong, and hey, Barry, Brian Singer here. I see that. I know you're in Hong Kong, and would it be possible? Wouldn't you like to come down to Torquay in Australia and just, we want to talk to you about maybe taking over Ripcurl. We'll send you a ticket, and I just said to her, I said, look, I'm here on Rusty business. I'm not really that interested, and I don't think it'd be cool if while I'm here, I went to Australia, because as much as I'd like to go and surf bells, because that's it's, thanks, but no thanks. And I left it at that, and I went back, and Rusty was going on. And then maybe, I don't know, 4 or 5 months later, they called me again. And I went and had a meeting with Rusty, and I said, look, because understand this, I didn't work, Rusty was the head of Rusty, but I was working for CNC Apparel, which was the licensee. So my bosses were the licensees, and they'd formed a different company just for the apparel. So I went to Rusty and I said, look, what are the chances of me ever getting any kind of equity in Rusty? Because I've had this offer from Ripcurl, and they've offered me equity in Ripcurl. And anyway, he said, look, I don't think there's going to be any opportunity, because those shares are so diluted, they're not going to. So then I took the job at Ripcurl. And
so what year is this? You start at Ripcurl?
You know what? Let me not lie. I'll have a look over here, because so
cool. Whilst you're checking, it's all going well. Well, at some point it'll be good to kind of, ask about some of the mistakes you kind of encountered along the way, some of your the things you learn along the way, advice for people coming up, starting a business now, so that kind of stuff, more like lessons and advice and mistakes and regrets.
Okay, that makes sense. Maybe we can do a kind of a bit of a summary of the various different companies you jumped through, and then jump into that, maybe.
Yeah, because it sounds like there's stages, so it's been really cool to hear the story. And I guess it's more like now, because we've heard the story, what are the kind of lessons that have come from that story that, if you could write a book about brand building, what would it contain? But yeah, that's great.
Cool. Yeah, sure.
All right.
That makes sense. So I'll reintroduce it. So right, you've just joined Ripcurl. You've been given, they're insolvent, they're not making any money, but they're going to give you a chunk of it. What year was this?
So I worked at Rusty from 88 to 92. And then I worked at Ripcurl from 92 to 96.
As the president, you were in charge of the whole company?
America, yes. Well, yeah, I had to report to Brian and Claw in Torquay in Australia, but yes. And it was tough. It was tough because I didn't realize how insolvent they were and what a bad reputation they had. And it was really difficult to convince people that, and the stuff they made was crap. The American stuff was terrible. So, I remember I made a pair of board shorts, and I remember I did the metal button on the snap of the board short, and I drew it, and I put tube tested, and everyone loved it. It was tube tested, riding in the tube and stuff like that. So there were little things that they just never did anything with. And then I think from a marketing point of view, Ripcurl got really smart, because Derek Hind, he's like the guru of. He's like a legend pro surfer, and he's such a forward, deep thinker. He thinks out the box all the time. But he convinced the Ripcurl guys to do this campaign called The Search. So The Search, because everyone, if you're surfing, no one wants to go and surf in trestles with 100 other people and have fights. So The Search was the search for these uncrowded waves, and they used to do their advertising campaign was pretty much a lineup shot of an empty wave. And then they got and Ripcurl had always sponsored some really amazing surfers with their wetsuits. And here's another thing with Ripcurl and with Rusty, a lot of their success came with other people's advertising. The guy from Quiksilver was riding a Rusty board, and they'd run an ad with him, and he'd be wearing Quiksilver top, but the logo on the board was prominent. Ripcurl was the same. Ripcurl would supply people with wetsuits, and you get Brock Little, who was sponsored by Gotcha, riding these huge waves in Hawaii, and it was wearing a Ripcurl wetsuit. Well, not in Hawaii. He wasn't wearing the wetsuit in Hawaii, but he'd have a Ripcurl sticker on his board because he was sponsored by Ripcurl wetsuit. Then so a lot of those early days, and in those days, brands like Quiksilver and Billabong and that didn't make wetsuits. They just made apparel. So Ripcurl started doing these ads called The Search, and Tom Curran was the world champ, 4 times world champion, I think, 4 or 5 or 3, one of them. And and he was kind of a recluse and a very sort of private person, and he hated the limelight of the industry. So they hooked him up with this young South African guy, Frankie Oberholzer, who was, they paid him not to turn pro. So he was a phenomenal surfer, and so him and Tom would get on a boat, and they would go, and Ripcurl would document it. Sonny Miller was doing all the photography, made all these search videos, and in those days, I think when I spoke to you earlier, there was no internet, there was no social media. You created your own heroes, and Quiksilver had pretty much a huge stable of pro surfers that were doing things. They would advertise it, and Tom Carroll and these guys. But Ripcurl did an amazing thing where they just made it cool. It wasn't about standing up with a trophy and claiming you the best in the world. They just went searching for cool waves, and Tom Curran's a gifted musician, and Frankie played the guitar. So where everybody else was on this pro trajectory, Ripcurl sort of pivoted and went into cool. And when you're a big brand, and that's the size is the enemy of cool, staying cool is difficult when you're big, and you suddenly everyone looks at you as this huge corporate company, and then you got this cool thing. Everyone wants to be on a boat in Indo, surfing uncrowded waves, playing the guitar and eating fish and that sort of thing. So that search campaign was really good for me, being the president of Ripcurl in America, because we could tag on to that, and suddenly Ripcurl became a little cooler. And it doesn't come down to the product. It comes down to the image and how cool you are in this niche industry, because everybody can make a pair of walk shorts. What's the difference between Quiksilver walk short, a Billabong walk short, a Whistler walk short, nothing. It's either canvas or twill, and it's got either fits you or it doesn't. But it's not. It's nothing special. It's not brain surgery or rocket science making a pair of shorts. Although Fabletics and Lululemon might tell you differently, but so it's.
What is it that makes it cool? Is it the advocate, the ambassador that makes the brand cool by proxy?
The ambassador, yes, has something to do with it. But I think if the company is cool, if you believe in the company, like Whistler is a cool company. They're environmentally conscious. They're not trying to be everything to everybody. And and I think, and their product is nice and it fits well and stuff like that. And they don't try and as I said in the beginning, they don't make skate, they don't make anything. So I think it's the company, because Whistler don't have any huge ambassadors. They don't have anyone on the pro tour, but they have these cool guys that surf. They get like a mid-length board or a long board, and it's just sort of, and their whole mission is just simple surfing. It's not doing an air reverse, and I mean, although some of their team riders, well, some of the people that they sponsor, I wouldn't say call them team riders. Some of the people they sponsor can do that, but it's not about that. It's about just that, and that comes down to the brand and creating your brand. They don't have one ambassador that I can think of off the top of my head, but I can tell you who Ripcurl sponsor, and I can tell you who Billabong sponsor. They sponsor Italo Ferreira, Ripcurl, Gabriel Medina. They're both world champions. Quiksilver, right now they've got a couple of cool young kids coming up, but I can't tell you who Whistler sponsors. But they sponsor a lot of cool board builders, people who make surfboards. To answer your question, is it about the ambassador? Not really. But it's important to have those cool guys.
Okay, yeah, that makes total sense. It's not that they're necessarily the biggest ones, but they are the coolest ones.
Yeah.
And actually, it's that sort of inferred coolness, reflected coolness that actually makes the brand cool.
That's a very good way of putting it.
Nice. Okay, cool. So you're kind of pulling Billabong out of the doldrums.
Ripcurl.
Sorry, you're pulling So you're pulling Ripcurl out of the doldrums, ready for the next sort of phase. I mean, how did that end, and what came after that?
It's a good story. A very good story. So, I was doing pretty much everything. I was designing, I was merchandise, and I would be the one traveling. At one stage, I remember in 6 months, I spent, I think it was 17 nights at home, but not consecutively. I was either in Australia, I was in India, and I was running around doing all this sort of stuff. And my strengths are creative, design, product, marketing. I'm not an accountant. Financially, if you want me to run the finance of your company, rather and put your money on black or red at the casino. So I'm not. I mean, I understand a bit of it, but I'm not the financial guy, and I'm not the operations guy. Although I think it's important. I used to work in the warehouse on a regular basis just to figure out what was going on, which I think a lot of people don't do that. A lot of people don't understand how the whole picture of the business. But Brian Singer, he's the one of the founders of Ripcurl. He's an amazing person, but he's out there. When I say he's out there, he gets shit-faced, and he does things that if he lived in America, he'd be arrested. And if he wasn't rich, he'd be arrested, I remember, they used to have the contest at Bell's. Bell's Beach is the big Ripcurl event over Easter, and they used to have a big media night. Brian Singer rode a camel through the offices, and this thing was shitting all over the place. But he was so pissed. And
where do you find a camel, right? So you had a few jars. Where do you find a camel?
Well, he would invite these this media night was a huge event in Australia, huge. So he would bring in these exotic dancers and camels and fire things, and he'd make a huge thing of it. And then one day, he got shit-faced, and he got hold of this camel and he rode it through the offices. Yeah, he'd do weird. I remember one time. So here's another example of how. I mean, he's brilliant. He's seriously he's a really genius almost. But he called me and he goes, "Hey, Barry, you need to get down here." So I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "I haven't got time to tell you. Just get on a plane and get down here. It's urgent." So now I'm in California. He's in Torquay. I go, "Brian, it's the middle of his." I said, "I haven't got time." And he puts the phone down. So I go, "Okay, shit, there's something going on." I book a ticket. And lastminute.com tickets are not that cheap. and I fly to Melbourne in Australia, and this guy, this pro surfer guy, Michael Ray, picks me up at the airport because Torquay's maybe a 2-hour drive from Melbourne. And I'm in the car talking to Michael Ray. I go, "What does Brian want? What's going on?" He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, he told me I need to get out of here quickly." He goes, "Well, that's strange." I go, "Why?" He says, because he asked me, "Where am I going?" I said, "I'm going to go pick up Barry at the airport." He goes, "What's he doing here?" You know? So I got to the office and I go, "Hey, Brian, what's going on?" He goes, "What do you mean?" I said, "You told me I need to come down here urgently." He goes, "Oh, shit, I can't remember." And that was it. That was it. So, and then why I'm telling you this, because this is the build up to, so I got to the point where I was just getting stretched thin. So I remember sitting down with them and I said, "Hey, look, we need to employ somebody, because I'm not in the offices all day. I'm traveling everywhere. We need to employ somebody with a financial background and who's got some sort of, organizational." So they said they agreed. So we got a headhunter and we got all these people, and we found this one guy, which I'm not going to mention his name because he ended up being all right. But anyway, we did this whole thing, and we decided that he was the guy. So I sat with him and I had made a list, and I said, "Look, these are all the things that I do, and these are all the things that I don't do well. And this is what you need to do." So, and so he had a list. And at the time I was still going on my Christmas holidays. I would go to South Africa and I'd surf Jeffreys Bay and Cape St. Francis. And St. Francis Bay is that's my sanctuary. Anyway, I had planned this trip to Jeffreys Bay over the sort of Christmas holidays. Anyway, so this guy arrives and I take him down because we just opened a factory and moved the factory to Mexico because the American one was inefficient and expensive. And I was doing all these different things. And anyway, I leave and I say, "Okay, see you. I'll be back in a couple of weeks." So then I'd been for a surf and I had this great surf. It was Christmas Day. And I came back and whoever's at the house said, "Hey, this guy Brian Singer called you." So I went, "Oh, gee, maybe Brian's just calling me to wish me Merry Christmas." So I phoned him thinking, just to say, "Hey, Merry Christmas." And I go, "Hey, Brian, what's going on? Merry Christmas." He goes, "Yeah, Merry Christmas. How's Jeffreys Bay?" I said, "Great, waves are good." He said to me, "Well, that was one of the things. Seeing that you're all the way there, I was talking to, I won't mention his name, and he seems to think that you and his management styles are going to clash. So while you're in Jeffreys, you're all the way there, you might as well stay there, you just don't rush back, just maybe spend a bit more time with your family or whatever." So I said, hang on, what are you saying? Are you saying that I'm out and he's in? He goes, well, if you want to put it that way. So pretty much I got fired on Christmas Day.
Oh, no.
And what had happened, this guy had gone to my assistant who I had employed and grew. This young guy, he had no experience in the apparel industry, but he worked really well and he was good. Anyway, he had gone to this young guy and said, look, I'm thinking of, if Barry wasn't here, could you do this, this, and this? And he had this list that I'd given him. And the guy said, yeah, I could do that. He said, I'll pay you more money and that sort of thing. So then he went to Brian Singer and he said, I was going through this, we could save a lot of money if we didn't have Barry, and I could do this and then James could do that. And Brian he goes, yeah, that's a great idea. Okay, do it. But he hadn't spoken to his partner, Claude, Doug Warbrick, who was his equal partner. And Doug thought I was cool. He really liked me. So anyway, I got fired on Christmas Day. And I was shocked. I really was, because we had turned the corner of the Ripcurl. We were starting to be profitable and we were getting some inroads with apparel and with watches and all sorts of things. And prior to that, so I've got to go back maybe a month or two, I'd had a call from, now Quiksilver and Ripcurl are both in Torquay. Their head offices, they both started. In fact, Alan Green and I forget the other guy's name, who the founders of Quiksilver, and Brian Singer and Claude, they had one company in the beginning. They were all from Torquay and that sort of thing. So they were all doing, and then they split. And Doug and Brian took Ripcurl, and Alan Green and John Law, the guy's name, John Law, they took Quiksilver. But they're across the street. So you see where your back window is. So where you're sitting is Ripcurl, your back window is Quiksilver. They're in the same street. They're across the road from each other.
Really?
Yeah. So when you go to Torquay, and I used to have to go to Torquay a lot. So when you're in Torquay, you're surfing with the Quiksilver guys and the Ripcurl guys. And you go into the pub and you hanging with the Ripcurl guys. Everybody hangs together. They have a annual Australian football match between Quiksilver and Ripcurl. It's kind of, it's like a little town. So I knew all the guys from Quiksilver, and they knew I was the South African guy that was running Ripcurl. So they had fired their licensee in Quiksilver had fired their licensee in South Africa. And because the guy was just useless. And no, he was making crap product, and he was not paying his royalties, and he would be drop shipping into territories that weren't his. He was just doing everything a licensee shouldn't do. And more importantly, he was just an asshole. The problem with that is, because everything with me is a story, because it is a story. His name was Barry as well. His name was Barry Dave. So anyway, the Quiksilver guys called me and said, do you want to do, and I was still working at Ripcurl. He said, do you want to do Ripcurl in South Africa? We're going to form a little consortium and maybe take it over and do it ourselves. This wasn't the owner. These were a couple of the sales guys and people at Quiksilver in Australia who I'd met. And I said, no, I'm very happy at Ripcurl. Thanks. I don't want to move back to South Africa. And then I got fired. So just after that, I was sort of trying to do a little startup thing in California, and the guys from Quiksilver called me back and said, hey, that thing we were talking about? We're not going to do this thing, but if you want it yourself, you can have it. So I called the guy he used to be my sales guy in South Africa. His name's Arthur Lamboris, an amazing guy. And Arthur, he's just, and he had formed, besides being an agent, he had formed a big clothing company. So I called him. I said, hey, do you want to do Quiksilver? And he said, when Barry Dave lost it, we applied for it, but they haven't given it to anybody. And long story, Quiksilver wanted somebody who had a bit of global experience, not just a South African company because they'd already had an experience with Barry Dave. So I said, well, if you want, we can do it. And we pretty much started Quiksilver. So without a contract, without anything, it was just a phone call. It was nothing. So I moved back to South Africa. We started Quiksilver.
And how was that? How many years were you there running Quiksilver in South Africa?
13.
13 years. Wow.
And we started, and that's where, before that, the marketing and the brand building, I wasn't that directly involved. Ripcurl, they were doing it mostly out of South Africa. I would get involved in magazines and running ads and stuff like that, but it wasn't something that we were creating. But when we started Quiksilver, now Quiksilver, because the guy had messed it up, they didn't have a licensee for maybe 18 months. They wanted everything to calm down. So when we started, it wasn't at zero, it was below zero, because the product was so bad and they had left such a bad taste in people's mouth. And also South Africa was kind of stuck in like hippie land. The surfing was, pigment dyed crap, and it was, those big oversized t-shirts, and they really hadn't progressed. And me, having lived in America and having lived with those brands, and I understood. So when we started, the first thing we did is we opened our own store. And our stores, we ended up having 26 stores, but our marketing, Arthur and I sat and we, I think, I'm not sure what it is in England, but the rule of thumb in marketing is between 5 and 8% of your turnover. Mm-hmm. I think in the first 3 years, we were maybe at 35 or 40%.
Wow.
Because we knew we had to establish the brand, and we were coming in on a low base. So we built stores. Our stores were unbelievable. Where the old surf stores in South Africa at that point were still like in, some wax and an old board and everything crammed together. And we opened these stores because Quiksilver just started opening their own stores in America. So we came in and we built these light boxes that nobody had ever done. In South Africa, I remember the Ripcurl guy in South Africa was charging the stores $60 for a piece of plywood with a sticker on it. That was their POP. So we came in and we were building sections in retail stores, putting light boxes in, and then our own stores, we went overboard. We had like marine tank in the middle of a store in Johannesburg, which is 600 miles from the beach. And it had little baby sharks and octopuses in it. And the stores were destinations, and people would walk in just blown away. The one store we did in Lelucia, I remember, that's in Durban. I got these people, these two women, they were amazing artists, but we built an octopus that out of this, it wasn't polystyrene, it was out of this foam. They crafted this octopus. It filled the whole ceiling of the shop, which is bigger than your showroom there. And in this octopus, and they'd painted it to look like a proper octopus, but in each tentacle, there was a fiber optical light. So when you looked up, there was a huge octopus. We spent so much money on that store. It was crazy, but it was so revolutionary. It was like, and after we did that, suddenly Billabong and those other people started amping up their stores and building sections. And the guy who was charging $60 for the sign, he just didn't progress. he just fell apart. But then the problem is we became so corporate. Suddenly we had Tony Hawk arrive, and we built a skate park in Durban, and Tony Hawk arrived with his circus and did this whole. There was this Tony Hawk skate park that was built there. It was huge, and then we would do big things. And I just said to the guy, I said to Arthur, I said, the problem is we're becoming too corporate. everyone looks at us as this huge big company. So I came up with this idea. It was called the Good Wave, where it was this event that was only open to locals, and it was by invitation only. And I chose who the competitors were. And it was on the best day in Durban. So the waiting period started the 1st of January and it finished on the 15th of December. So we could run the event at any time. And the entry fee was $1, and you had to pay it in the coin. And the prize giving was, I think in those days, it was like the equivalent of 100 grand for first prize. It was like the most money anyone had ever received. And it's a one-day event. And we had jet ski assists, but we became cool because it was a local thing and it wasn't this big corporate. We didn't build big tents. We came in there, we put up the waiting period would start 2 days before. We'd watch the charts, we'd watch everything, and we'd go, okay, we put in, it was an amber light, and we had a website with the amber light and a green light. When the green light was on, suddenly people were scrambling from Cape Town, from Jeffreys Bay. They had to get on planes, and it became, and down to the beach. It was a one-day event. You'd get there, we'd feed everybody, give them beers, and it became like a cool little vibe on the beach, but with a big prize. So everybody wanted to be invited to the Good Wave. And it wasn't about Tom Carroll or Kelly Slater or any of these guys. It was just about the local crew. So we did that, and then we got this big bus and we filled it up with our pro surfers and surfboards, and we would go to these little coastal towns between Durban and Cape Town, which was the whole entire coast. And we would stop there, and our guys would take the locals and let them try out the new boards and go for a surf with them, let them wear one of the new wetsuits. So we started doing these like grassroots marketing things, which made us a whole lot more legit to the local people. We weren't suddenly this big corporate company that didn't care about the local people. And I think that's when you build a brand and you grow that big, you lose sight of how you started. You know, no one looks in the rearview mirror. They're just looking forward. And sometimes you do have to look in the rearview mirror for certain things. You know, what made you successful and how you started. Suddenly you become successful and you forget about that crap. You know, so.
And that kind of grassroots thing, that doesn't scale, but is that what makes it cool? To use that term, which we talk about, that's what makes it cool, and cool is what the brand is built on.
Yeah, exactly. You know, it's hard to do when you're part of a global brand, and they have their marketing, and suddenly you're doing this. But yeah, we still obviously did some of the big corporate things, but it was a big lesson to us, and that Good Wave thing, just that little, there's 25 surfers. That was it. And they had jet ski assists, and it suddenly every swell that arrived in Durban, and it was held at the same beach all the time. It didn't move around. It was in Durban. So every swell, if the surf was good, the guys would say, "Hey, the waves are really good today." And the first comment would come and say, "Is it Good Wave good?" Because everyone was waiting for the Good Wave. People would take off work. The day we ran it, and we ran it pretty much every year, because it wasn't the best wave or the biggest wave. It was just the Good Wave. So, by definition, it just had to be good. It didn't have to be great.
It's amazing. And so you're getting all this kind of word of mouth that's coming through these grassroots communities who are just like, you're just embedding yourself into it. Like, what do you think other brand builders can learn from that experience?
Goes back to Michael Thompson's thing. Size is the enemy of cool. You got to
do the things that don't scale.
Sure.
And in terms of your experience, what did you learn? What would you have changed? What would you not done the same?
We didn't understand enough about social media marketing, and I had never heard of Google Clicks or any of those things before, and suddenly, we have to Google. The cost of acquiring a customer on the internet here in America is more than it would be in a brick and mortar store. It's crazy. It's crazy. And I think I spoke to you earlier, or the first time we spoke. Google clicks. If you want to be on that Google thing, you bid. It's like the stock exchange. You have to bid for words. And in winter, you want to sell a flannel like that. Flannel is suddenly, $5 a word. And all someone has to do is click on it, not buy anything, and it's $5.
The rising cost of acquisition is the biggest problem that every single one of the brands we talk to has right now, and it's just unsustainable. And they're looking for ways to build brands, and they could probably learn a lot from your experiences and actually doing it previously, because you didn't have the luxury of buying clicks and buying ads. We had an instant source of revenue. You had to invest in building a brand. You had to invest in the reputation piece of it. And actually, interesting, Gymshark, the ones who are inspiring it, have just opened up their first store as a marketing endeavor, as a brand building endeavor. So the world is really coming full circle back to the world that you helped build.
Well, I also think, and I look at my kids, but I think the day of these expensive influencers and whatever you want to call them, I mean, it's over. What do they call it? OGC is more important than what you can do. The owner-generated content. If some kid is promoting, is surfing and wearing something, you don't have to tell everybody what you're doing. It's people are so tired of internet ambassadors pushing shit on them that they don't even believe in. That sort of credibility is no longer exists, I don't think, anyway. These people that call themselves, there's Kim Kardashians, and there's a few people that do have these idiot followers that will buy any shit that they promote. That's the people aren't that stupid anymore. But I see I see these young guys, they want to start a clothing company and they internet things, but they're ripping people off. My son bought and I'm not going to say which one because they'll get bumped, bought a hoodie the other day for $108. Okay. You got to understand, I know how much things cost. $108 hoodie, and I saw the quality of it. Maybe, at best, if you were buying small quantities, would have cost that company maybe, and this is a stretch, $12. And they put a print on it for $3. And they sell it for 108. They're very limited in their, maybe they're only going to make 10 and they have to justify it. But that company can't grow to the extent where they could become a brand. They might become this cool little, my son could go into a concert and he'd be the only person out of 10,000 wearing it. And then that's good. If that's cool, then that's cool. But they're never going to be a brand like Gymshark.
Who just
as much as I hate to say.
Well, they're doing very well for themselves.
They do. Amazing company.
And I think that's a really nice place, I think, to sort of leave it. Is just the way that it sort of evolved from your very early kind of careers in it into now, and actually where everything is going. So if there's one piece of advice that you would give to aspiring brand builders, what beyond who are looking to get into the space, what would you say to them?
I would say do proper research as to who your target market is and how you're going to fund the growth of it, because starting it is the easiest thing in the world. Continuing and growing it is the hardest thing. And I'm sure that's what you guys do. You help people build their brands and grow their brands. But if you're underfinanced and you in a space you know nothing about, there's only one way you can go.
Yeah, well, that's good advice. Barry, it's been an absolute pleasure.
And
Thank
for
you
me,
so
and
much
just-
for making the time.
And just one thing for me, I think I've always been, I wouldn't say, I'm not going to say successful, but I've always been involved in things that I'm passionate about. If you're not passionate about something, don't do it. It's, if you're going to, unless you want to make ball bearings and nuts and bolts, and it's just a commodity. But if you're in a brand, unless you actually live it, unless you're passionate about it, unless you understand it from a grassroots level, don't do it just because everyone else is doing it, because you will fail.